Post Scriptum and Hell Let Loose, two World War II games that seemingly are doing very similar things, and a question I constantly get asked is, World War II wise, should I go for Post Scriptum, or should I go for Hell Let Loose? Now, in this video today, I'm going to be addressing that question, and talking about everything that is Hell Let Loose and Post Scriptum, and more importantly diving into specific details that I feel make the two very different games, and in some cases, make one superior to the other. Now, before I get this video underway, I do want to say that in no shape or form am I dismissing the development of these games. Hell Let Loose and Post Scriptum are two games that have very healthy communities and very active developers who are currently developing both games. So whatever you end up deciding for in this bracket, they're both definitely worth investment because there is a community there and there is a development crew that is actually pumping time and effort into the games at the present time of making this video. So don't feel disheartened if I say that one is better or one is superior in a certain way, because that doesn't mean that the other one isn't trying or isn't developing as a title, and they're both relatively early access in some areas. And also, people can enjoy things, so even if I don't enjoy something, that doesn't necessarily mean you won't. It's just my personal opinion, and I don't think I should be necessarily, beating on anybody for enjoying one game more than the other in a certain aspect, because I personally don't. But it's just my opinion and my perspective, and if that's something I think you guys value, which for the most part in a lot of my videos I feel like you do, or if you're new here and you want to see what I have to say, then certainly read into it. So with all of the understanding of a strong development and community behind it, it's time to talk about everything inside it. I'm going to talk about content, I'm going to talk about game mechanics, and then I'm going to talk about things like graphics and sound. So let's start with content. As it presently stands, Post Scriptum on the whole has more content than Hell Let Loose. There are more maps, more weapons, and even more factions. Now, this will be set to change in the future, as Hell Let Loose has a number of factions planned, such as the Canadians, etc., and so does Post Scriptum. They've already recently released the French faction, including brand new French weaponry, brand new French vehicles, character models, and brand new French settings. And of course that's going to change in the future, but as it presently stands, Post Scriptum has more. And something worth noting on that front is that because Post Scriptum is running off the Squad engine, it won't be long until you see modded maps on Post Scriptum as well, created by individual players. Something we're not entirely sure will be coming to Hell Let Loose, or something that isn't very much available in the foreseeable future, whereas this is something that's a little bit more imminent in Post Scriptum's lifestyle due to that link to Squad. They both feature fantastic, iconic scenery of World War II, and both feature iconic weapons such as the M1 Garand, and, everything you could possibly want really in that kind of area. MP40s, STGs, it's all very much there. But more recently, of course, Post Scriptum has diversified with the French faction with weapons like the Short-Chat, which is great to see, in the Lebel rifles. It's also introduced at least 2 to 3 different types of armor for the French faction, and even things like anti-material rifles to damage tanks and completely obliterate infantry. So on that front, I think it's safe to say that Post Scriptum is certainly doing better in content, and most likely in the future, due to the modding support, which often does get ported into the games in the long run, I think it's safe to say that Post Scriptum will maintain the edge on content as things move on. But again, that's definitely left to be seen. Now let's talk about sound and graphics. Sound and graphics in both of these games is great. I think Post Scriptum has a tendency to look a little worse in some places on lower resolutions, but as somebody who's playing on 1440p, both games look pretty good and they run pretty well as well. I haven't really had any performance issues on either Post Scriptum or Hell Let Loose, but bearing in mind I am running a relatively beefy rig, an i9-9900K and a 2080 Ti graphics card, so things may variate with your own setup, so definitely check out the recommended settings for both of these. And graphically speaking, yeah, I wouldn't say either game looks particularly bad. Both of them have incredible scenery. I think they have really good skyboxes especially. I find that Post Scriptum and Hell Let Loose do a great job at creating World War II atmosphere with the setting around it and just the way it works. I think Hell Let Loose certainly has some more World War II scenery with broken fences, dead cows, and sometimes destroyed buildings, which you don't really get the same kind of atmosphere in Post Scriptum in some places. places. So I'd say in terms of graphics, Hell Let Loose slightly has the edge. I don't think it's necessarily the best edge in the world, and I must say in terms of clarity and in terms of gameplay, Post Scriptum definitely does better being a clearer game, to be easier to see targets and to be able to scale your HUD. I think Post Scriptum is much easier in the sense of being able to understand who's an enemy and who's a friend. So although Hell Let Loose is slightly prettier in some places, I would say that Post Scriptum in terms of practicality is better in some places, but we'll dive into that a little bit more when I talk about gameplay. Now in terms of sound, honestly I'd say these two are neck and neck. You know, I really don't think there's a huge discrepancy. If you play either of these games, you'll have a premium sound experience. Post Scriptum does a fantastic job at simulating the kind of combat and war around you and all those impressive sounds. But what I will say is that Hell Let Loose is equally as good. Machine guns, tanks, everything in between, they both sound fantastic. I think you'll find that Hell Let Loose is perhaps a little bit more punchy in some places, whereas Post Scriptum is more finely tuned. I think Hell Let Loose has a tendency to sometimes get arguably too loud and a bit too in your face with some sounds, whereas Post Scriptum, that really only happens when there is an excess of enemies around you and lots going on. The one thing I will say in terms of sound design though is that I do believe that Post Scriptum is superior in audio placement, and again this does tie into gameplay and we'll talk a bit more about that later, but for the most part I think in terms of identifying where an enemy is coming from, Post Scriptum certainly takes the edge for me. And again, this links into the fact that it's using the same engine and the same architecture as Squad, and Squad arguably in my opinion has some of the best positional audio in any video game. It does a fantastic job of making it very easy to suss out where enemy players are in terms of audio, so it's really no surprise in that category. Now let's talk about gameplay, and this for me is where the two radically diverge and where I personally feel Post Scriptum takes the edge and becomes the better game. Now, the reason I say this is down to a different mantra of what's trying to be achieved here. I think Hell Let Loose tries to take a bit more of a simulation approach. I think it's trying to be the best, closest replica of what World War II was actually like, whereas Post Scriptum is very much aware that it's a gameplay experience and is trying to make the game fun and satisfying. And I don't think that's something you really get from Hell Let Loose. I think Hell Let Loose punishes you a lot for no reason in the game, you know? I don't feel as though skillful players in hardcore and tactical shooter situations are necessarily rewarded in Hell Let Loose because, well, I guess in World War II it didn't matter if you were the smartest guy on the field or the dumbest guy. If somebody shot you from 200 meters away, you're dead. And I think that's the big difference for me. Hell Let Loose is focused and honed in on having these replica maps that don't necessarily equal great gameplay experiences, whereas Post Scriptum is very much focused on great gameplay experiences that perhaps don't have the most authentic feel in the world. You know, I'm sure some of the flags and some of the layouts are just made up, and some of them are relatively historically based, and you can actually see that some of them are. Lots of maps in Post Scriptum do have historical influences and important buildings from those eras during World War II, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that defines exactly how all of its gameplay works. There are a number of examples where this comes into play and makes one game feel worse than the other. The biggest one for me is maps. Post Scriptum has a great way of making maps. Post Scriptum allows you to move through bushes, whereas in a game like Hell Let Loose, if there is a bush line, you can't go through it. And to me, I found that incredibly jarring, because it funnels players into certain areas, and you can see it on any game of Hell Let Loose when you look at the map. Everybody is being funneled through like 2 or 3 lanes to the same objective, whereas in Post Scriptum, there's absolutely no limitation to where you can go. You can go through bushes, you can go over walls, you can go, you know, through these thick hedgerows, and that's not a problem whatsoever. And because of that, you aren't limited in the scope and scale of how you get to an objective, and you aren't limited in terms of your attacking points. You can literally attack an objective from any 360-degree area. The same is possible in Hell Let Loose, but because of the thick hedgerows, and because of the fact that it's kind of obvious where people are coming from, because they'll only either be in an open field or on a road, because they can't be moving through hedges, they can't use a hedge line to move through to objectives. And because of that, I find that Hell Let Loose feels very much on rails. It feels like it just bothers me. It bothers me because it feels very limited. It bothers me because it feels like players are being restricted in what they can and can't do, and it feels as though people are being funneled into one location. And it also doesn't play well because of that, because everybody is just constantly dying. You can't utilize cover because there is none, because it's replicating history. You know, yeah, sure, World War II was lots of open fields, but for crying out loud, at least a few, I don't know, mortar ditches or, you know, a few more bushes or something to at least give people some actual cover. It just doesn't seem to exist in Hell Let Loose, but in Post Scriptum, there's loads of cover. There is loads of different bushes. There are loads of trees and foliage that you can use for cover, walls, broken walls, trench lines, and everything that possibly give you any kind of advantage to traverse towards and away from objectives, and it has such a significant impact on gameplay. In Hell Let Loose, if you try to flank around, chances are you're going to die hundreds of times running into the middle of nowhere because it's just open fields. Flanking on Post Scriptum is effective because you can define your own route. You can use the maps to find out where the trees and trench lines are going to be and where you can use those places for a tactical advantage, and you can utilize them because if you run into a hedge, you don't stop, you go through it. You can use the hedge as cover, you can use the hedge as concealment, and it just doesn't work the same way in Hell Let Loose. So lack of cover and map design is definitely something that I feel Post Scriptum does significantly better than Hell Let Loose, but another area that really bothers me is movement. In Hell Let Loose, you feel like a ton of bricks. You feel like you're running around with a stove on your back or something. It's ridiculous how sluggish your character feels. Whereas in Post Scriptum, you're very maneuverable. You can aim down sight and crawl, which isn't a feature in Hell Let Loose. You have to stop aiming down sight to crawl. You can even crawl fast by using your stamina. You can do things like being able to lean whilst laying down. There are so many different things that I could point towards, and in Hell Let Loose you just don't have that. Your character moves slowly, and this combines with another problem. Because the movement system in Hell Let Loose is so sluggish, the ballistic system suffers too. Because in Post Scriptum, because players are relatively maneuverable, and the ballistic system doesn't make it very easy to hit long-range shots, if someone's 200 meters away, you're going to struggle to hit them. You might get around to it eventually, but it takes a skillful, well-played player to make those kinds of shots. Whereas in Hell Let Loose, bullets travel incredibly fast and seemingly without very little drop-off or drop-off damage. And because players are so slow, it's so easy to nail them at distances. And I feel like that contributes to the fact that people are running through open fields and just die constantly every 20 meters or so, and it just doesn't create a fun gameplay experience. Now, a lot of people will say, well, isn't that what hardcore and tactical shooter players want? And the answer to that for me is no. Like, at the end of the day, as much as I play these games to be a bit more realistic, I don't play them to be boring. I don't play for them to, you know, be ripped apart by machine guns and just trench fire every 5 seconds. And yes, whilst I am aware that that is an accurate depiction of World War II, at the same time, in Post Scriptum, I can flank these things, I can move through hedgerows, I can move quickly into cover, I can make it difficult to shoot me at long ranges and serpentine. That's just not an option available to you in Hell Let Loose, and it's not something I find to be an enjoyable gameplay experience. Another huge thing for me in terms of gameplay and the actual experience these games have is the expectation of communication. In Post Scriptum, you are expected to use your microphone. Now, whilst lots of people in some places don't, on the more reputable of servers where everybody knows each other, or at least there's some kind of community there, every squad lead, every person you play with will have some form of microphone, and you'll be talking to each other, and it makes for interesting and strategic engagements because everybody has a conversation going on about what they can and can't do and where they should go. In Hell Let Loose, that just simply doesn't exist. There are some people who talk, but for the most part, it's just a game of silence, and a game of hoping that your squad leader lays down a deployment point for you, or hoping that some kind of command element lays down deployment points for you. At least in Post Scriptum, if somebody isn't communicating, they get ripped on for it. And whilst I'm not saying that that's necessarily a good thing, because I'm sure there are some people who don't play with microphones, it certainly creates better gameplay experiences, because people have an expectancy to work together, and people can actually call each other out in constructive ways to try and improve the gameplay experience happening. I've had entire games of Hell Let Loose where I've had to run hundreds of meters because nobody had a deployment point down, and nobody who was actually in charge of doing those things was talking to each other either, and that just is incredibly frustrating. And whilst I'm sure there are Hell Let Loose servers where there are plenty of people who communicate and work together, like there are Post Scriptum servers that do the same, there is a difference in culture in terms of what is expected in just the bang average games as well, and I find that personally Post Scriptum is more honed towards communication, and because of that creates a better environment and better community experience personally. One thing I think, if I could summarize the gameplay experience, is that skilled players in Post Scriptum feel as though they're being rewarded for actions and intelligent thinking, whereas in Hell Let Loose I genuinely don't think it doesn't matter how good or bad you are at the game, because at the end of the day you're still going to die from like 200 meters away in a field with some guy that you probably can't see. And I think that's probably one of the most critical pieces of the game. In Post Scriptum, it's actually really easy to kind of feel and know where people are. You can see them very clearly because the game doesn't make it difficult to see enemies. You can hear where the gunshots are coming from, you can see the traces very well, and it creates interesting engagements. In Hell Let Loose, I feel like a lot of the time you run around in an empty or open field or a hedgerow that you can't go through, and if you get caught out in the open, which is normally about 85% of the map, you're going to get shot from somewhere, and you won't know where it's from because it isn't explicitly obvious, or the suppression will be so intense that it probably doesn't even matter if you shoot back, because you're dead anyway. And that feeling of just feeling kind of cheated that you just didn't get a chance to really do anything is something that I think certainly stales the experience of Hell Let Loose for the most part. Now, in conclusion, I think I'd safely say, for me personally, Post Scriptum is the superior game. It just does things better. It just does the way gameplay environments work better. It creates more interesting and more enjoyable experiences than something like Hell Let Loose. And Post Scriptum doesn't even have things like experience points and ranks and levels, whereas Hell Let Loose does. And it does that purely by just creating a gameplay environment where you feel rewarded for intelligent actions and feel rewarded for being fast, being maneuverable, being intelligent. And I gotta say, regardless of what map I played on Hell Let Loose and regardless for how long, it really felt as though every couple of minutes I'd just get shot from the middle of nowhere, and it would just ruin the gameplay experience for me. It'd ruin the fun of it all, and you know, it just felt like I couldn't do anything. It felt like I couldn't use hedges, I couldn't use cover, I couldn't use some kind of speed or maneuverability. It was just, well, you're out in an open field and there's a guy with a rifle, so you're dead. And I guess that's really it. If you want something that's perhaps closer to an actual historical accurate in terms of how things went gameplay, then maybe Hell Let Loose is for you. That's not to say that Post Scriptum isn't accurate, I just think the focus of open maps and focus of actually replicating like-for-like places in Hell Let Loose is what truly hurts it the most, whereas I feel as though the development of Post Scriptum has been focused around enjoyable gameplay experiences. That's my personal opinion today, folks. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Is there anything that you have questions for? If there's something you want to know about the two games, feel free to ask and I'll let you know. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon in another video.